Well, aloha, everyone. It is so great to see you here on this Aloha Friday, May 29th, here on the COVID-19 care conversation on the platforms of the Honolulu Star Advertiser. I'm Ryan Kalesuji, joined, of course, by Yanji Denise, and we want to, first, always like to thank our sponsors for making this conversation possible. That, of course, is the Hawaii Executive Collaborative and Hawaii Pacific Health for really allowing us this opportunity to engage with you in the community, to bring you the resources and information that you need, and the opportunity to speak to some of our leaders, as well as those who are in power, to sort of address some of the questions that you may have. So, of course, we want to encourage all of you to enter your questions in today. Yanji, it is a crazy time that we're living in, of course, with COVID-19 here in the islands. And we also recognize there's a lot happening throughout the country and our nation. Is not lost upon us that there is a lot happening and seemingly a lot of division, but that's why these conversations are so important, so we can address and talk to our local leaders, and we have one of those leaders on here today.
That's right. Scott Saiki is joining us. He, of course, is Speaker Saiki, and we are so happy to have him with us. The legislature has been hard at work over the last 2 weeks to figure out where they think the CARES Act money should go and how best to respond on a state level to the pandemic here in the island. So we're very excited to have him on. There's been some back and forth between his office and the executive branch when it comes to where that money should go. So we want to ask him about that. And a lot of you also have expressed some concerns about what's happening when it comes to releasing inmates because of the coronavirus and the actions that were taken there. We're going to ask him about some initiatives that the legislature has made to try to rein that in as well. So we have a lot to talk about with him. Please send in your questions. Before we get to him, of course, we'd like to start with the count. We did have 3 new cases for a total of 647 positive now statewide since the pandemic began. Those 3 cases were here on Oahu. That ends 7 straight days of no new infections on this island. But still, we have what Lieutenant Governor Josh Green likes to call the flattest curve in the country.
That's right. We spoke to Lieutenant Governor Green yesterday to get a little bit more of his insights on where he sees, things are heading, and he thinks it's heading in the great positive direction. Thus, the ability for many of these restrictions that continue to be lifted. We know today is a significant day here on the island of Oahu with barbershops being open. We're seeing water parks as well as other outdoor gatherings that are allowed of groups of 10 or less. So more and more each week we are seeing some of those restrictions lift and can expect to see more of those continue to happen as long as those numbers stay low. So we'll continue to keep you posted here of those numbers, and be sure to stay connected to the Honolulu Star Advertiser for those daily updates on those numbers.
Big number also today in the paper, tax revenue projected to drop $2.3 billion. Obviously so many folks haven't been working, and that means that the state can't collect taxes, and that means that they're going to deal with a major budget shortfall. We want to welcome in Speaker Saiki to talk about, hello, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
We're so happy to have you with us. And we want to talk about the budget shortfall and what you folks have been doing to try to figure out how to make these numbers work.
Right. So we always knew that we were headed for a shortfall, and the Council on Revenues met yesterday to provide us with another projection. The Council on Revenues meets every quarter, and the legislature is bound to the projections that are set by the council. So yesterday's projection was, somewhat pessimistic. Although the economists on the council do project that at some point in time the economy will rebound, but for now we're looking at, according to the council, an approximate $2.2 billion shortfall. This shortfall was anticipated by the legislature, which is why we reconvened our legislative session about 3 weeks ago, and the purpose of that session was to address a potential shortfall.
Speaker, I want to talk to you specifically about some of the decisions that were made during that time. And we got a lot of questions over the past few days about the legislature's decision to sort of put some of this CARES monies aside, as well as some other funding into the rainy day fund, sort of as a way to prepare for the future. Some will argue, and some within the building themselves, lawmakers saying that money should be used now, that money should not be put aside. Can you explain the reasoning why and the thought process behind why money was put aside when so many people are struggling right now?
And before you answer that, if you could just speak up just a touch, we're getting some feedback that they can't hear you as loud as they need to hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Is that okay?
Yeah, maybe just project as much as you can.
Okay, I'll speak louder.
Please go ahead. Yes, but that's a very important question. We'd love to know your thoughts on that.
We do have, so the state of Hawaii did receive federal CARES funds about a month ago, and the funds were basically distributed in two buckets. So the first bucket was a lump sum of about $1.25 billion. The second bucket is actually a growing number. It's about $5 billion so far. So the first bucket, the $1.25 billion lump sum, is the one that draws the most attention with the public. This is an amount that is shared with the counties. So the City and County of Honolulu received about $147 million of this. The legislature voluntarily agreed to provide the neighbor island counties with $164 million of that lump sum amount, which meant that the state was left with a balance of about $650 million. And the reason why we wanted to provide funds to the neighbor islands was because we worked with the neighbor islands to ensure that those funds would be spent to provide immediate relief to neighbor island residents, just as Oahu is doing with its share. The neighbor island counties, as well as Honolulu, are providing food, housing, childcare services to all of the residents on the neighbor islands and in Honolulu. We felt that the quickest way to provide this kind of relief was through the counties. The balance, as I mentioned, was $650 million, which we deposited into the rainy day fund. We wanted to just spend some time to assess how the counties would spend their funds, but also how the second bucket of federal funds would be spent. The second bucket, as I mentioned, was about $5 billion. And these were the funds that were allocated not just for the direct payments to individuals, but there were dozens and dozens of appropriations made for specific kinds of programs. And again, these were for food programs, housing, childcare, even domestic violence programs. These were programs that were highlighted by the federal government. We wanted to take some time to ensure that those funds were being allocated appropriately by the state agencies that receive those funds, and that those funds are being spent. Before we make any decisions on the balance that is in the rainy day fund, we want to make sure that we do not duplicate anything that is being spent by the counties and the state agencies.
Why can't some of the rainy day money that were put aside be used right now? I think there are people who feel like they're suffering, they're waiting for those unemployment benefits. By putting that in that bucket, as you say, aren't we just delaying giving resources to people who need that relief immediately?
So the plan is for the legislature to return again on June 15th. We'll reconvene our session probably for a couple of weeks. And at that time, we'll be making some decisions on how to appropriate the rainy day funds. We know that that there are still a lot of people who are waiting for the unemployment applications to be approved, and in part that's why the House of Representatives worked with the Labor Department about a month ago to stand up the unemployment intake center at the convention center. We wanted to help the department to process the backlog of applications. But having said that, we are well aware that there are people who are still waiting for unemployment checks, and that there are even families who receive unemployment checks who still need assistance, and we'll be addressing that when we reconvene.
So unfortunately, Speaker, we are still getting comments about your volume. So if you could just, I know you're kind of more of a soft-spoken type of guy.
Or maybe just move it this way.
Yeah, or maybe
that might help.
Hold your mic up closer when you talk, and maybe just do that one side with that.
No,
there.
Yeah, this side.
Okay,
excuse
the other side.
the media.
There,
there
okay,
you
go.
sorry.
Oh, perfect. That's much better. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, Ryan. Go ahead.
No, so we also want to talk a little bit more and address some of the safety concerns that were being raised. We know that some of the steps were being taken to release some inmates, and some of them, gotten released because of the COVID-19 threat, and many. And so, we've already got reports of a handful that have already got rearrested for crimes that they committed. Well, what steps are maybe being taken to sort of address that and the concerns of public safety?
Yeah, so when we learned about the Supreme Court's decision to release inmates, and this was probably about 6 weeks ago, we immediately wrote a letter to the Supreme Court to inform them that we were opposed to this. Oh, my screen just went off.
No, 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 you're
We can
good.
still, we can
Okay,
still
We
hear you.
see you here. Yeah.
okay, sorry. We wrote a letter to inform them that we were opposed to the release of inmates for a couple of reasons. One was that when the Supreme Court made its decision, it specified that it would be presumed that the inmates needed to be released. So basically, the Supreme Court ordered that that inmates be released unless there were some circumstances, to not release them. The second concern that we raised was that the courts needed to verify the residence addresses of the inmates before they released them, and this was to ensure that inmates not end up being homeless, because we knew that there were going to be a number of inmates who were going to be released and may end up on the streets. The Supreme Court basically ignored our request, and today what we are seeing is an influx of inmates who are who are homeless, and as this is reported a few days ago, 50 of the 300 released inmates have been rearrested. What has happened is that this nonprofit service providers, homeless providers, have been overwhelmed with requests for assistance. Private sector is not having to step in to provide resources for these released inmates. We get it at the legislature. We get it that prisons are overcrowded and that there may be potential health concerns in the facilities. But the rate at which the inmates were released and without proper safeguards was a big concern for us.
So what do we do now? For the folks who have been rearrested, obviously they get charged and their crimes are processed. But what about the remaining 300? And I mean, how do you see this program continuing with those who have been released and those who may be released going forward?
Yeah. So what we did when we reconvened last 2 weeks ago, we imposed a requirement on the judiciary that the judiciary report on the status of each released inmate to the legislature. We are requiring the judiciary to provide a weekly status report to us, and that report will provide um, basically the whereabouts of each inmate and whether or not the inmate has committed more crimes.
I want to go back to sort of something that you were talking about earlier, and this 3 week sort of waiting period in between, as you said, reassess to see what the needs are. We actually got a question that was sent in from Jody, and that was asked why is the legislature taking 3 weeks of break to figure out what to do best with the money and how to spend it? Weren't these things figured out before you went into session? We did hear from members of the leadership a few years back, especially even on this conversation when we talked with members of the House who said they were using that time to prepare for session when they came into session, so they knew what to do with the money and how to spend it. Again, if you can sort of explain what led up to the session, what plans were made, and why, maybe addressing Jody's comments about why the legislature is now having to take another 3 week break to figure things out.
hmm So, our regular session began on January 15, and it was scheduled to end on May 7. But on March 16th, we learned that one of the state senators had tested positive for COVID, and so it was at that point that we recessed the legislative session. So from March 17 up until May 11, the legislature was in recess, and it was during that time that the state received the CARES Act funds, and that was when some decisions were made on how to allocate those funds, including the one that I just mentioned, which was that we wanted to maximize the funds that were made available to the county government so that they could provide some immediate and direct relief to residents on all of the islands. We really didn't want to rush and spend all of the lump sum money because that is a one-time payment. Once that money is spent, then we will probably not see another uh, uh, appropriation like that unless the federal government provides more funds to the states. But at this point, it's not really clear if that will happen. So we just did not want to spend all of the money immediately, because we know that in a few months from now, maybe 6 months from now, there are going to be more needs. There are going to be continuing needs in our community, and we want to be prepared to be able to fund those needs at that time.
You know, there are some folks who believe that the executive branch, the governor, should have control of those funds. Why did you think it was important for the legislatures, for the lawmakers to have control of those funds and shifting the money in that way to kind of guarantee that you guys would be making the call as opposed to Governor Ige?
Well, it's going to be a shared responsibility. We're going to be working with the governor and his administration to identify the areas where these funds should be spent. It was just important that the legislature be involved, because the 76 members of the legislature have a pulse on their within each of their communities as to what the needs are, not just in their communities but also on their islands. So we wanted these decisions to be made collaboratively between the administration and the legislature.
One of the guests that we had on earlier this week were members of the retail as well as the restaurant association, and talking about some of the challenges they're facing. One of the biggest challenges they talked about was just rental payments and being able to afford rent, and that being a big indicator for whether they're going to be able to survive this or not. We're seeing other states implement some things such as tax incentive to landlords and renters that are able to provide relief and take the ease off of these renters and these establishments. What is the state looking to do to sort of help these important small businesses through programs that might include a tax incentive for landlords that don't pass on these rental charges to their merchants?
So one of the things that we did when we reconvened 3 weeks ago was to authorize the governor to borrow funds from the federal government. The governor is authorized to borrow up to $2.1 billion from the federal government. And I think that maybe through the use of the borrowed funds, that perhaps there could be some kind of a loan program set up to assist not just businesses but also individuals who are in need. Um, we will also we will take a look to see whether or not there's a possibility of providing some kind of tax relief for businesses that goes beyond just the postponement of taxes. But it's also important for landlords, and especially the larger landlords, like for example, the Ala Moana Center owner, to provide relief to their tenants. I ran into a constituent about a month ago who does lease space at Ala Moana Center, and she said that her lease rent was $100,000 a month, and her business was shut down at that time, and she wasn't able to pay that lease rent, and the Ala Moana Center management was not responsive to her request for some kind of relief. It's really important that these large landowners find a way to provide relief for their tenants.
We can't have an economic recovery without schools. We want to bring in a couple of the questions. Someone who goes by CHAB says, our keiki have lost a lot during this time too. Get the summer programs going while the quarantine is in place. I know that we've had Dr. Kishimoto on here before. They are standing up some summer programming with 6 to 8 kids in a classroom, but tell us about what you think the fall looks like for students, and what the state can do in that regard. When we talked to Dr. Kishimoto, she said simply that they just don't have enough teachers to implement the kind of social distancing that the CDC is requiring right now or recommending right now.
Yeah, the Department of Education is in a really tough position, and a few weeks ago, I appointed a committee in the House to investigate the implementation of a long distance Hawaiian language immersion program and what it would take to stand up a program like that. And the reason why I did that was because not only because the Hawaiian language immersion program is important, but I also wanted to see what we could learn from that, as far as what kind of what the needs are, and how do you set up a distance program within the DOE. I think that one thing that we've learned from this pandemic is that the DOE will have to use distance learning as a part of their regular curriculum. This will help to address some of the long-standing problems we've seen where there are insufficient teachers in rural areas, in some of the specialized subject matter areas, in special education. Um, we're going to have to employ and use technology within our public school system. And it's easier said than done because it will be costly, and you have to assume that the schools are even equipped to handle the increased electricity load, and that families have access to Wi-Fi and computers. So there are a lot of issues that have to be addressed, and I'm hoping that we can begin to learn more about this through the House committee that was set up on Hawaiian language immersion. And it's really fortunate for us as well, though, that you have Kamehameha Schools has offered to assist the DOE with distance learning. Kamehameha Schools had to rapidly implement a program over the past few months for their students. So they learned a lot through that process and are willing to share their experience with the state.
I think the other question that, the $1 million question for all of us is tourism, of course. And how do you see that getting stood up again when we look at, they've talked about a tourism bubble, perhaps something like Japan, a country to country tourism bubble. But what do you see in terms of actually reopening tourism when it comes to standing up our economy?
Yeah, so as we know, tourism is just vital to our economy. Tourism accounts for about 18% of our GDP and about 24% of the jobs in our state. It Having said that, I've seen a couple of surveys recently, two independent surveys that show that about 70% of the public is very kind of ambivalent or wary about the rapid reopening of tourism for public health reasons. Public health is, of course, our number one priority, and the tourism industry, I know, is well aware of that as well. Um, Tourism has to be opened incrementally. It cannot be an abrupt reopening. We have to show the public that tourism can open slowly and that it can be safe for not just for residents but also for visitors. Um, we'll be working with the governor to reopen neighbor island travel first. I think that will give us a good gauge on what kind of a public health system uh, we'll need, what kind of safeguards we'll need in place for neighbor island travelers. From there, I'm hopeful that the governor can then incrementally reopen travel between Hawaii and the continental US, and also with foreign countries, and particularly within Asia.
One of the questions, again, going back to the DOE question, was about protecting teachers and staff. So one of the questions was about PPE and finding, ways to provide masks, disinfectant wipes, sneeze guards to protect the staff and teachers. The state only gave $200 for this, can the CARE money help out in that way to help protect the teachers during this time, as public schools could potentially be resuming in the fall?
Yeah, so when we reconvened 3 weeks ago, we did make appropriations to the Department of Health and also to the Department of Defense for PPE. So the Health Department received $14 million for PPE, as well as for test kits and supplies. We've appropriated $40 million to the Defense Department, and that's because the National Guard is responsible now for the pandemic response in Hawaii, but that those funds can also be used for PPE and other supplies.
So I'd love to get a sort of timeline from you. Now you've met and obviously moved this money into the rainy day fund. You'll take the next 3 weeks, I believe, is it just interact with constituents, work behind the scenes, and then you come back? And how long will that be for? And how much money do you expect to appropriate then?
So our plan is to reconvene on June 15th. I'm assuming that we'll probably be in session for a couple of weeks, which is what happened when we met again in May. I'm not really sure yet what the amount will be. Because we will also have to factor in what is happening with the council and revenues projections and how that impacts some of the assumptions that we had made with the state budget.
Okay. Lastly, sorry, Ryan,
No.
Billy Jones says Hawaii won't recover for a decade or longer. What are your thoughts on how long it will take us to get out of this hole? I mean, we're still in the middle of the pandemic. We still have very low numbers, but we still do have new cases of the coronavirus here on the island. So we know that the virus is with us. People talk about getting back to normal, but what do you think about Billy's comment that it's going to take a decade or more for us to get back to where we once were?
Well, we have a pre-vaccine scenario and a post-vaccine scenario, and hopefully we'll have a vaccine developed sooner rather than later. Even when there is a vaccine in place, though, public health is still going to be very important for all of us. We will still have to continue with all of the health safety protocols, even when there is a vaccine. I think that tourism will probably take a few years to rebound, but I'm not sure if we want tourism to rebound to the levels that we saw prior to the pandemic, where you had maybe 10 or 11 million tourists visiting Hawaii a year. That is it may have been a little bit too much. We're going to have to kind of recalibrate and see how we can diversify and enhance other areas of our economy. We cannot be over reliant on one sector. I mean, that is something that has been made even more obvious to us. But it's going to take a lot of consideration by the entire public as far as what kind of direction we want to go in on the economic front and what we're willing to invest in and develop over the next few years.
All right, Speaker Scott Saiki, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We know that you guys, as you mentioned, are preparing to get back into session. So we'd love to get an update when you folks get back in there and to hear again from the leadership about some of the things that are happening during that time. So we'll definitely keep in touch, but certainly appreciate your time spending with us here this morning.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having
All right.
me.
Thank
All right,
you.
aloha.
Bye.
Well, interesting to hear his thoughts. I know a lot of people had some concerns about what we talked about, that back and forth between the executive and the legislative branch when it comes to the money. But, he's sort of explaining why they put the money in the rainy day fund in the way that they did, and that they'll be back in the middle of next month to figure out how to actually spend it. And so I think lawmakers will be going out talking to their constituents, and I'm sure that they will be getting an earful no matter where they go about how that money should be spent and how fast and who needs it the most.
Yeah, and I think that it's very telling that there are obviously a lot of needs that are in the community right now, and we saw a lot of comments about this pause in this 3-week window of why the legislature is sort of not acting, and one of the reasons why he said is simply because they want to see how the counties are going to be able to allocate their funds before deciding how the state is going to get involved, and not sort of double dipping, as he said, and making sure that money is spent in the right place and not to rush out there. I know that doesn't comfort a lot of people who are continuing to wait for unemployment, and we see that backlog happening. So we know that there are a lot of concern about the extended timeline that they've sort of put on making these decisions. And we will continue to keep trying to get in touch with these lawmakers and those in charge in these leadership positions to be able to ask them some of those questions about the decisions that they're making that are ultimately impacting so many here in our state.
Yeah, and we have Governor Ige coming on Monday, so he's going to be talking to us about, his thoughts on what the legislature was able to accomplish in their session over the last few weeks. One thing that he did say yesterday, and this is making headlines in the paper today, is that the Transpacific quarantine will go beyond June. So he had kind of indicated, we had gotten that indication already, but now he's made it official yesterday, saying that ending the mandatory 14-day quarantine for folks coming from outside of the state of Hawaii will go beyond June 30th. So we know that, this idea of standing up tourism is definitely not in our sights at least not until July, and probably well beyond that. The inter-island quarantine, of course, is a separate issue, and we do expect an announcement. Lieutenant Governor Josh Green said he expected an announcement sometime next week. The governor also indicating that yesterday when he had a Facebook Live session with all 4 county mayors.
Yeah, the governor's saying we are very close. I think a lot of people are just sort of on standby, just waiting for that announcement to come through. We also heard from hotel officials who are saying that they need some warning. They need some advanced planning to know when the neighbor island quarantines will be open, as well as when the lift will be made for the mandatory 14-day quarantine for out-of-state visitors, because they simply have to prepare and decide who and how they're going to re-implement some of the procedures and employees that they need to be brought back online. So hopefully we will get an answer to that. Again, we will talk to the governor on Monday and see if we can get an update on that with maybe a specific timetable. We've also heard of this concept of the travel bubble. It was discussed yesterday in our conversation with Lieutenant Governor Josh Green. It was further discussed yesterday with during a Hawaii tourism sort of Senate briefing that was held yesterday at the state capitol with the Hawaii Executive Collaborative, really talking to that Senate Special Committee on COVID-19 about some of those efforts. And one of them was potentially setting up this travel bubble with Japan because of the low number of cases that they are experiencing there, and looking for other countries that may have similar case numbers to protect sort of the areas that aren't maybe necessarily seeing those large number of cases that continue on now.
Yeah, I mean, Japan is such an important tourism market for Hawaii, and if we could get something like that off the ground, it would make a huge economic impact. We're also next week going to be talking to the head of the Hawaii Tourism and Lodging Association, that is Mufi Hanneman, talking to him about all those hotels who are shuttered and what is happening with them, how fast they can open up, and what they're looking at when it comes to their business. The vast majority of hotels in Hawaii have been closed for some time now, so what does it take to get them back up and running? So we're looking forward to that conversation with Mufi Hanneman on Thursday. Of course, we always like to highlight a Hawaii hero. And yesterday, over 110 local nonprofits ministering to Hawaii communities most severely impacted by the pandemic and economic shutdown received some very needed funding from the 2020 Sony Open. The host, Friends of Hawaii Charities, distributed $1.2 million in charitable grants. That's from proceeds raised through the Sony Open. And that's in partnership with the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation. So we so appreciate them for getting those funds now directly to local nonprofits, which provide food, shelter, safety, healthcare, all the things that our community needs, from Keiki to Kupuna. And so we so appreciate the Sony Open and all of those charitable partners getting those monies into the hands of people who need it most.
Yeah, the Hawaii Charities are really helping to provide that support and partnering with those various nonprofits to be able to administer those funds. Again, we're seeing a lot of this happening in our community, and want to just continue to say mahalo to all of you who are doing such great things in the community. You know, not everyone is giving away millions of dollars like the Sony Open, which is, of course, needed and certainly appreciated. There's also just small little acts of kindness that are happening throughout the community. And we want to highlight all levels of kukua and support in this community during this time. So encourage all of you to please let us know of your Hawaii heroes so that we can spotlight them in our daily segment.
Yeah, and Billy brings up a question about the travel bubble. Japan could come in with no quarantine, but if I leave Hawaii and go to Vegas and return, I need to quarantine for 14 days. I think there are some people who will have some pushback on that idea. The whole thinking, Billy, is that those folks can confirm that they were tested before they come. Japan has similar levels of virus to us here in the islands. And so the idea is that that is a safe little bubble. You know, you heard Lieutenant Governor Josh Green yesterday saying that he advises people not to go to Vegas right now because so many people would be coming in there. It could be a place where there could be a much higher level of virus. So yeah, Billy, I hear you. I think that there will be people who will be concerned that why not domestic travel? Why open it up internationally? So we are inviting some folks who are behind this travel bubble idea to come on and talk to us and explain it in more detail, because it could be a huge economic boost to our country or to our state. And also maybe some of us could head to Japan if we have the funds to do that. That could be nice too. That's
right. Again, we will talk to Governor David Ige on Monday. We also have Scott Murakami from the Department of Labor and Industrial Relations coming back on Tuesday to discuss more of the unemployment questions that we know many people continue to have as they sort of chip away through the backlog that many people are continuing to wait for. Wednesday, we continue on with our Hawaii Pacific Health Ask a Doctor segment. Looking forward to hearing more about some of the health things that are happening in our community. And as Yanju was saying earlier, we'll be talking to Movie Hanneman tomorrow from HLTA, on Thursday, HLTA on next week, Thursday. So we're looking forward to that conversation as well. Again, we want to thank our sponsors, the Hawaii Executive Collaborative, as well as Hawaii Pacific Health, for keeping this conversation going, and for all of you for continuing to tune in. We know that we can't get to every question that comes in, and there are so many of you that are loyal viewers. We see the same names every single day. We appreciate you tuning in. We appreciate the questions, and we apologize that we aren't able to get every single question in there. It's only a half an hour show, so we try our best to get as many and diverse comments and questions as we can in there. And certainly, though, appreciate you tuning in and asking those questions and being involved in this discussion, because it's a conversation that I think we need to continue to have as we move this state forward.
That's right. And Crystal says, please keep Hawaii safe. Please do remember that. Thank you for that comment, Crystal. Please, as we start to open up, of course, this is the first weekend here on Oahu where you can get together with people outside of your immediate household in groups of 10 or less. So as you start to interact with and re-engage and reconnect, in person with people, please do remember to wear your mask, wash your hands, practice physical distancing as much as possible, while still, showing everyone your aloha. We so appreciate all of you joining us. Stay safe out there. Flattest curve in the country. Let's keep it that way. And we'll see you right back here on Monday.
Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.